Rabbi Moshe Denburg, born in Montreal, came to Boca Raton in 1989.
And you are the founder of Chabad in Boca Raton.
That's correct.
And I am Sandy Krichenko-Altner. I am a volunteer with the Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum. And this project is to record the oral history of the Jewish community in Boca Raton. Today is September 21st, 2016, and we are at the beautiful studios at Lynn University in their communications department. So welcome,
Thank you very
Rabbi
much.
Denburg. It is such a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk with you and to learn today about Chabad.
Thank you,
Before
Sandy.
we get into how it is that we have a Chabad community here in Boca Raton, could you please tell me what is Chabad?
Okay, start off with the big questions, huh? Well, today actually it's interesting that you're asking this on this particular day because the founder of the Chabad movement was born on this particular day, some 250 years ago, in Russia. And the Chabad movement is a Hasidic sect, and it began as sort of an offshoot of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. And it was a movement that put tremendous emphasis on love of a fellow person, love of a fellow Jew, a tremendous emphasis not only on study, the intellectual connection that we have with our Torah and with God, but also the emotional connection that the founder of the Hasidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov, also was a strong proponent and certainly, emphasized that a person needs to connect to God emotionally. And the Chabad movement sort of wanted to introduce as well that an emotional attachment to God, a healthy one, starts off actually through intellectual awareness, intellectual study, and so on. That's sort of the deeper philosophical approach to Judaism. But it was really sort of to not only become a functioning, observant, traditional Jew, but a Jew who felt alive and vibrant with his tradition, and one that would sort of put him on a path that he wouldn't just want to fulfill his duties. He'd be excited about it and go above and beyond the call of duty.
That's a very good and thorough explanation, but there are so many more questions that come with this. Right. Not the least of which is in the studying that I have done of the movement of the Jews out of Eastern Europe through the 1880s into the early 1920s, where we saw 2.5 million Jews uprooted and moving to the land of unknown. At that time, when people were arriving in Ellis Island in New York, for example, we do know that there was a tremendous conflict in some families where so many people wanted to leave behind the old traditions. And I'm talking about the kind of garments that were worn, the wigs for the women, the facial hair for the men, and the very distinct look of the people who followed Chabad.
Correct.
And they came to Ellis Island and they wanted to be Americans. They did not want to be seen as greenhorns.
Correct.
So tell me a little bit about that period of the newcomers coming to New York, because of course so many Boca people come
Correct.
from New York, so it's part of our story.
It's interesting you bring that up. My father, who came to Canada, to Montreal, because that's where he had relatives that were able to sponsor him, he came after the war. And he came, although himself was probably a little bit liberal, he came from a Chabad, in those days, a Lubavitch family. But he went to university, but always remained observant. His entire family came to Canada and to America in the early 1900s. Their parents to escape being conscripted to the army and so on and so forth. Of his entire family that came in the early part of the century, none of their children or grandchildren remained traditional or connected to their Judaism in a very large way. So they were correct in assuming that America, they would say in Yiddish, was the Treifene Medina. They called it the Goldene Medina and the Treifene Medina. The golden country, the place that all opportunity was there, but also a country that had such distractions and such opportunities that it wasn't necessarily conducive because you no longer lived in the shtetl, you no longer lived in the ghetto with a good connotation. And that the truth is Jewish day schools, proper Jewish day schools just weren't available to support your family, not everybody worked on Saturdays in those days. Sunday was the day off, and not to work on Saturday was almost a guarantee that you couldn't get a job. So living life as a Jew was very difficult in America, and their children, because they were, I believe, torn between having them pursue a livelihood which was foreign for the Jew before, that they can actually do whatever anybody else is doing and have the same financial opportunities. They push their children to be financially free, and saw that what came to them naturally was secondary for their children. You know, they came from a shtetl that had a synagogue on every corner, and their grandparents at the table, and Shabbos was alive, and so on. And they imagined that would happen also naturally to their children. But they were wrong. As they were pushing their children to become regular Americans, it didn't have the same fair balance of the emphasis on Judaism.
I think to many Americans and Canadians, certainly when we saw Fiddler on the Roof for the first time, there was a reference point now to give us context to how these families came from the different kinds of troubles they had, the poverty, the persecution, the pogroms, and to be able to come to America in that way. How true or not true is that version of that visual, if you will, of what our reference point is to the ultra-Orthodox Jewish individual?
I think that it's probably close. I mean, except that he just seemed probably a lot happier than most people were. I shouldn't say that, actually. You know, they depending where you were growing up, but certainly being Jewish was being a second-class citizen. Again, you could not live necessarily in wherever you wanted. You were forced to live in a particular place. You were forced to have only certain jobs. You knew that you were going to be taken advantage of because they could. And also you were forced to wear your religion on your sleeve, and I mean that metaphorically. So even in a place like Russia, where officially religious freedom was allowed, you were clearly noted as a Jew in the class. And for instance, when there was school on Saturdays, they would know if you didn't come. So, and even in the cities that my father grew up in Russia, there were officially synagogues, but they were synagogues that most practicing Jews didn't go to because they knew that they were being watched, and they just didn't want to get into trouble, even though officially you were doing nothing correct. So in the case of the communists, they wanted to weed out religion. And then in other places, but there were nice eras. I mean, the Jews of, everybody sees Poland, for instance, during the war. But what's amazing is there was life in Poland. And I think there's one interesting thing that Fiddler on the Roof doesn't sort of lend itself to, that if you see Jewish life in Poland, you see that not everybody was religious. Everybody has this imaginary vision that everybody in the shtetl was religious and Hasidic garb. There were gymnasiums, there were theaters, there was a whole life. Certain cities maybe more than others, but Jews just lived happily and freely as Jews. But there were many, many Jews that chose not to, wear the Hasidic garb or be observant in all ways. So there was just Jewish life, very traditional and very, their heritage played a strong role, but they weren't necessarily 100% observant.
What are the names of your parents?
My father is Label. His Hebrew name is Yehuda Leib. In Europe, they would many times take the Yiddish pet form of the Hebrew version. So Leib means a lion. And Yehuda, the tribe of Judah, is always depicted as the lion. So he was called Yehuda and Leib. And my mother is Esther Fruma.
And they came to through to Montreal, but at what year did they come, and where did they come from? So
my father came from Russia, so he, thank God, was in Moscow at the height of the war, which, thank God, the Germans only made it to the outskirts of Moscow. And my mother, who was younger, so she has less of a real memory of those days. but her family grew up in Poland, Galicia, and she's from Galicia. She was born there, but they were sent to Siberia, which wasn't the Hilton, but it certainly saved their lives from the unfortunate other alternative. And then they came after the war.
So they met in Europe.
My mother probably was if my father would have dated my mother in Europe, it would have been probably even illegal back then. She was much younger. But they came to Montreal, and my father came with a sister and a mother. His father died, unfortunately, of starvation in Russia. And
Sorry.
yeah, and then, interestingly enough, my mother's parents both came to Canada, and unfortunately both got ill and died, even though they had made it to safety. But then, chance had it. My father's family had a very good friend who lived in the same home as my mother's parents. And when my grandfather from my mother passed away, this gentleman said to him, "Don't worry, I'll take care of your daughter. I'll make sure," she was the only unmarried one, "that she marries." By then she was already 18 or 19, and he knew my father. My father was much older. I don't know if we should say this, but he probably lied a little about his age, or probably conveniently didn't remember by a year or two. And he introduced the two of them, and they met and they got married.
So your parents lived a different life than your grandparents and your great-grandparents did, because their life in Judaism was different in the old country, as it was called, as opposed to what was going on in the progression of the communities changing, as you had described earlier.
Right.
So that in itself is kind of an interesting conflict, to bring an old way, a generation or two later, back into a family.
I think my parents, my father, for instance, my father's father had a beard. My father never grew a beard. My mother certainly didn't want him to have a beard. So while I am certainly from a Chabad family, my parents were certainly maybe more liberal than others. But my father was already, he was already a graduate of university still in Russia, so he was very much an adult. And very much understood what was happening in Russia, and very much involved with many adults. So he really lived that life. And but when he came to Canada, he knew one thing, that he wanted to have good education for his children. And plus he felt in his heart that he belonged to Chabad. And I don't know if it's really the intent of this interview, and we have the time. But my father, while he may not have looked the part, felt very close to the idea of being a chassid, a follower of a Rebbe. At that time, at least when he came to Canada, in the previous Rebbe, the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, and then the late Rebbe that was, that lived till 1994. So he felt, when he came to Canada, he felt that he was connected. His father was connected to that Rebbe. He went to that Rebbe for advice. He felt very connected. And so he wanted certainly that his children should connect not only to a proper Jewish education, but also to to philosophy. So while he may have wanted us to be in business, to have an easier life, he got stuck with two of us becoming Chabad rabbis.
Very good. So, and you are two rabbis within a sibling group of how many?
A small family, actually, 4 boys.
4 boys. Now, let's talk a little bit about how it is that someone who grows up with that background in Montreal has come to be the founder of Chabad here in Boca Raton in 1989. What was your journey?
Well, it was either Boca or Moscow, so I really didn't know. No, I'm just kidding.
All right.
Either Boca or a small city in Spain. No. So my father, as I said, sent me through the system of Chabad schools. Things have changed a little bit today, but I had an opportunity when I was 18 and a half to go with 9 other students to continue our studies in a yeshiva in Caracas, Venezuela. And we were very connected to the Jewish community there. And of 20 at that time, unfortunately, I watched Venezuela with such a deep pain in my heart because it was such a thriving Jewish community, an amazing community. And we probably, without exaggeration, I mean, of the 25,000 Jews, the 6,000 families that were there, everybody knew us. We were like sort of a unique sight in those days, and it was the first real presence of a real institution of Jewish learning. And so most of the day we learned, but then we had access to the schools, to the Jewish schools, to Jewish families. And then after that 2-year stint, I continued going to smaller communities. And I realized that I really did love this. I really didn't know I wanted to be a pulpit rabbi per se, but I certainly felt that helping people connect in whatever way it may be, could be a story, could be a mere hour, or wow, I'd love more. Can you come back? Can we learn? Can I come over for Shabbat? Can you come? So I really love that part. And I went to very small communities in South America, some of them with no rabbis whatsoever. And I realized that it brought me a lot of satisfaction. And the Rebbe at that time, I spent many years in New York. The Rebbe would speak hours upon hours. Anybody who Googles during the week, we call them Fabrengens, these long talks for 4 or 5 hours on Shabbat. Certainly, having a group of people that were willing to devote their lives to moving to communities to fill in the gap, whatever it may be.
And these people are emissaries.
That's correct.
And they are called shliach?
Shluchim. Shliach is singular,
okay.
Shluchim plural, correct. So I grew up hearing that, and I knew how important that was. Now, whether the Rebbe would have enough without me was not a question that it was certainly something that I felt was important to the Rebbe, and therefore became very important to me. I always told my parents, you sent me, can you imagine sending me to medical school for 12 years, and then I came back and told you I wanted to be a plumber. I said, you sent me there, this is what it's about. And so my whole life, I tried to connect learning with this type of work. And so every summer, I would, instead of going to summer camps, I would always opt and volunteer to go somewhere. And I did that my whole life until I got married.
When was the first time you came to Boca Raton?
The first time I came to Boca Raton was actually 1989. I came probably January of that year. Maybe later. January, February of that year.
As a shliach?
No. You know what? I'm actually probably making a mistake. I probably, maybe March time. What happened was that there was a woman who unfortunately passed away. Mrs. Kaufman, Anita Kaufman, who was very involved. She lost her husband at a very young age. Her and her husband were very involved in Jewish education in Suffolk County in Long Island, and involved with the Chabad rabbi there, Rabbi Tovia Teldin. And she, wherever she got involved, she loved Chabad, not because she was Chabad, not because she was even observant, but she felt that she had other experiences with other organizations, and she felt that the openness, the acceptance that Chabad had of all Jews, independent, obviously we have rules that we still have to abide by, but the willingness to accept people at their level, at their level of participation, was always really refreshing to her. So when she came to Florida, she was in Plantation. She did the south to north trip like many did. And then when she came to Boca, she said, in '88, she said, Boca is going to see growth like you can't imagine. And I always turn back to her, and she was so right, because in 1988, 89, when I came to Boca Raton, I still remember Glades was 2 lanes. Back and forth. They were still just doing construction then. There was only Old Clintmore. There was no Clintmore Road that we have now. It was the one just north of it. I mean, the city was definitely different. There's no doubt about it. Broken sound. I remember coming from up north and, one day driving the road and the next day seeing the palm trees. Coming from New York or Canada, to see all of a sudden a mile stretch of road with palm trees that weren't there yesterday. You grow up in your house and your tree's been there for 40 years. So the place was really growing like crazy. And she moved into the Polo. And she had a son-in-law who was religious, an ordained rabbi, but not by profession. And she decided that when he comes to visit, she wants to have a synagogue for him. And the only one that she wanted to connect with was Chabad. So she contacted Chabad and said, send me a rabbi to Boca Raton on one condition, that he be within walking distance of the Polo Club. So I always wanted to go to Florida. I had a brother in Coral Springs. I'd come to Florida my whole life as a kid, up to 13. I loved Florida. And I told Rabbi Biston, who was in charge of sort of developing the area, who's presently in Parkland, I said, if something ever comes up, call me. I'd done some work for him. We got along together. He says, there is something. There's an opening in Century Village. So I said, I wasn't necessarily looking right away for a pulpit rabbi. Maybe I was thinking of developing something on my own. I said, you know what? I'll pass. So I said, but I have an idea. I have a friend, actually a newly acquired friend of the last couple of years, that I think it might be good for him. And that was Rabbi Bucket. Contact Rabbi Bucket, and Rabbi Bucket said yes. They had just a struggling minyan then. The conservative was very strong. Now it's unfortunately the conservative is empty and the Orthodox shul is booming there. And he said yes. And what they needed really was leadership. But they only wanted a weekend rabbi. They wanted a full-time rabbi for a weekend pay. So I told Rabbi Bucket, if an opportunity though ever arises in Boca, there is still this talk about another. But there was already some murmuring about a potential synagogue that Anita Kaufman wanted. I said, if that ever opens, I told Rabbi Bisson I'm very interested. I would come down for that, and then we could partner to develop Chabad for Boca. So he said, okay. He took that job. About a month later, it developed in a very concrete way. She wanted me to come down for Pesach that year. I couldn't. Rivka was pregnant.
You had met Anita Kaufman at this point.
Yes. She was, as she always liked to say, she needed to vet out the rabbi before he came. She was very particular. So I had to go down to Long Island for an interview with Rivka and myself. And
Rivka is your wife.
Rivka is my wife. And we interviewed. Apparently she liked us. And I said, I can't go for Pesach though. We'll send someone else. We sent somebody to the Polo. She made a minyan in the Polo that Pesach. And in June of '89, I moved down with my wife and my son, a newly born son, Yossi, and we came to Boca Raton.
Tell me about Anita Kaufman. What kind of woman was she?
Anita Kaufman was, first of all, I think that she was truly a genius when it came to her vision of community. Just how she just hit it on the nose. She had this idea that she liked to go to communities on their way up and then go on to the next community and see how she could impact it. And it's interesting that in Long Island, and there were newspaper articles to the effect that when she started to re-engage in Jewish education, and obviously she was emotionally attached to Jewish education in Suffolk County, because that's where she started with her husband. Years before that, Jewish education, everybody was leaving Suffolk County, federations and schools, everybody was going to somewhere else in Long Island. And she said, this is crazy. There's Jews here, and what's happening here that no one's supporting Jewish institutions? And she said, no, we need to build a school once again in Suffolk. And she committed herself monetarily, and till today this school is there. I'm not saying it's not without difficulty, but here you have a lay person. She has no leadership role, not in a JCC, not in a federation, certainly not in a synagogue. every single rabbi is saying, we've given up. And one small, powerful lady says no. And she was amazingly generous, far beyond probably her real means, in a sense. One would imagine that who knows what, but she was just committed to making, and she did that in many counties, in Long Island and in Boca.
Let's talk about what happened in Boca when you first got here in 1989, and Rabbi Buket was here.
No, he wasn't here. I actually moved here first.
Okay.
I moved here in July. He came right before the Chagim, right before. I found him actually his house to rent, so I came here right before. So, but I don't hold that against him. I just like to throw in for seniors,
So you arrived. What did you and Rivka find in the way of a Jewish community to greet you here?
I would say it was almost non-existent. And to no one's fault. So I'll first share that when I'd come down before, I had met with a group of parents who were members of other synagogues who wanted more as far as Hebrew school was concerned. So I had a commitment of about 8 to 10 parents to start a Hebrew school. That's really what I knew that I was going to do when we came. That being said, we knew that Rabbi Buket was going to be in Century Village. I knew I was stuck somewhere in this vicinity.
Within walking distance of the Polo Club.
Mm-hmm. So I rented what is now called Meisner Court, was then called Coral Harbor, which is the corner of Military and Clintmore. And it's rental apartments. And we rented an apartment there, 1401. And I tell you this number for a reason. So we rented an apartment. We were walking distance. We came right before Rosh Hashanah. We were excited. So we put out ads. And we rented Calusa Elementary School. We rented at Calusa Elementary School. We had about 90 people. We rented the music room. We were all excited, but the truth is, people came because there was no membership. They didn't know where to go. But really, the truth is, I had nowhere to take them afterwards. I had no place to say, oh, by the way, did you like this service? Come to this address. I had nowhere for them to go. All I had was my home address. And I remember, interestingly enough, I don't have a contact with them now, but I remember when I was going to Calusa Elementary School to work on the renting of the location, a guy in a Jeep, a man and a lady, put on their brakes. They saw me walk out of my car, and they said, "When did you get here?" So I said, "Excuse me?" He says, "When did you get here?" I said, "About a month ago." He says, "Are you Chabad?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Are you here to stay?" I said, "I hope so. I think so." He says, "Oh, now everything's different." So I said, "Please tell me, what's your names?" Tell me the name. I said, "Where do you live?" "We just rented in Broken Sound." "Where do you come from?" "New York area." So he says, "We came here to escape for a little bit, but now we see you guys are here." And we had a very long relationship with them. They had a place in town center and so on and so forth. Their kids came to us. But I remember that when I came home very excited to Rivka, I said, "Oh, now somebody from up north knows that this is the beginning of the change of Boca Raton." But it wasn't entirely up to us. There was certainly a lot of help in the community, as we know, that we'll talk about. But when we came, so we like I mentioned, we had these 9-10 families that wanted to start a Hebrew school. And so Rabbi Buket was west, I was here. So we said, we'll rent a location that's smack in the middle. There's no logic to it, actually.
Because you can't walk from either.
Right. At least one of us could have had some benefit. But that's what we did, and we started a very long relationship with the owners of the Jewelers Exchange. Glades by the Turnpike, and we rented 800 square feet on the second floor. And we started to advertise a Hebrew school with no affiliation necessary. And that Hebrew school continues until today. So that was the one thing that we always said that will never change from, because we're always here to fill gaps. That Hebrew schools, for most synagogues, you need affiliation with the synagogue to to belong to the Hebrew school. So we said that's one thing. There should be a Hebrew school in town where you don't need any affiliation. And that was...
Oh, very good. And that is...
We didn't even get to Boca.
No, we're still here. Don't worry. Don't worry. That's just a cue for me. We have plenty of time. When we think about the tremendous change in the community, the Chabad community starting with, as you said, just a half a dozen families that came from your advertising to let people know that you were available to be able to do these things and so on.
Right.
And I read in Sue Fishkin's book that you had services in your kitchen. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Is that at 1401?
1401, yeah. So again, I had nowhere to advertise really. It was 6503 North Military Trail, apartment 1401. And I remember somebody had called saying, do you need a photocopy machine? I said, yes. So he says, but it's in North Miami Beach. So I ran down to North Miami Beach. It was a doctor's office. We put the copy machine in the car. And then I saw that he had those old trifolds, with the metal aluminum, with the material to change into the robe behind it. I said, do you need that? He said, no, I'm throwing it out. I said, could I take it? He said, yeah. That was my first mechitza, my first partition. So it's just enough. So the apartment had a small little...
Like the trifold things that we would see in a hospital room?
Yeah, correct.
And that worked out okay for you?
I guess so.
You figured right away that would serve the purpose God would accept.
Right. So we sat in the dining room / living room. The kitchen was there. Rivka would prepare a little kiddush, a little something afterwards. I remember somebody gave me some numbers to call, and there was a gentleman who I'm still friendly till today, who lived in St. Andrews. And somebody said that he's a minyan goer, but he's a walker. So I called him up. I said, I'm new in town. We're starting a minyan. He said, you have a minyan? I said, sure. A quorum of at least 10 people? He said, okay, because I'm walking from St. Andrews. I said, no problem. He came. He's very punctual. It was me, him, and I think one other person. He says, where's your quorum of 10 people? I said, it's coming. An hour later, 4. 10 minutes later, another 5 person. We didn't have a quorum of 10, but that's how we started, basically. And till today, he can't walk anymore. It's a little harder for him, but we've remained amazing friends. I always call him my first congregant. And
what is his name?
Simon Gerstel. Simon and Bobby Gerstel. So we started from there, and slowly. It was very hard, though, to develop. I was there for about a year and a half. And then I rented Calusa Elementary School, the music room, for another year and a half, closer to 2 years. And every Friday I would go, bring the Torah, bring the books I think they would let me store there, set up those chairs for the music room, move the musical instruments, come back before Monday to put back the stuff, take my Torah back, and that's also we did Friday night.
And from those very humble beginnings, as we say, things have changed tremendously in Boca. I think it was as of 2000 or 2001, the actual demographics show that 1 in 2 who live in Boca Raton and in Delray Beach are of the Jewish, count themselves as Jewish, we'll say, because that in itself becomes a very complicated term. But, and when you said that when you first arrived, there was really not much of, certainly not in the Orthodox community, there was Reform, there were conservative rabbis, there was a presence of Jewish people here, but it's changed tremendously, where now I understand that the Orthodox community is the fastest growing Jewish community in Boca Raton. Is that correct?
I would say that that's probably true. I mean, 1 in 2, you mentioned that. I find that hard to believe that it's 1 in 2, but even 1 in 4 would be amazing. I always tell people that you can live in New York, and then you come here, you can feel more Jewish, or you could feel that more Hamish almost. And I say this because while there are more Jews in New York, you go, depending on where you live, if you step outside of your community, if you live in a strong Jewish community, you go into a dry cleaners, the chances that the person next to you is Jewish is not necessarily going to be high. But here in Boca Raton, you can walk into a store, you can walk into your dry cleaners, and you turn to the person next to you, the good chance is that that person next to you is Jewish. So it's amazing. That is amazing.
Is Hamish a word for good feelings?
Yeah, good feelings. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, when we've seen this community grow, how did it become? Once you and obviously there was a struggle just to get this thing structured, to get it to a point where people understood that there was a place. But the big problem was you didn't have a formal place. When did the synagogue come?
So, right, that was probably, no matter what, people do want a place for bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs. So I rented a store in the polo shops. And I had that for 7 years. And it was an amazing place, actually. It was very intimate. It served its purpose. They wouldn't let us rent it without some type of retail in the front. So we had a Judaica shop, which also was amazing because today there are Judaica shops and you could go online. But except for one there were two at the time, but one in Meisner, I think, eventually came. And then there was another one that was around for a long time. I think it was called Holy Land. But it served so many purposes. People came in, they bought kosher mezuzot, and they bought kosher tefillin. They would come out just to find out when the anniversary of passing is. So really it became its own, like almost like these Judaica shops in Jerusalem, like its own little information center. So it really allowed, if the rabbi wasn't on premises, at least it certainly allowed for somebody to be able to come in just to a place of Judaica and Jewish information. So it was an amazing thing. I didn't want the hassle of having it, but all those years, it really, I still today, people come to me and say, oh, I remember the store, I remember Dina who worked there, I remember, you helped me with this. So it really just became also like a help booth, an information center.
And then eventually that led to gathering enough people to actually go forward with building a synagogue?
Right, so I felt that I really wanted to I knew that I was still stuck to this neighborhood, which is not stuck, everything's divine providence, so obviously I was meant to be here. And I went to look for where would I build a synagogue. Next to the fire station there was land, and then all of a sudden somebody told me that there is this piece of land that looks very narrow from the front, but it's actually 6 acres. So I went to pursue that. And to make a very long story short, there was someone already that was looking into it. His name was Rob Levy from the Levy family. I contacted him. I said, I want to purchase the land. Not that I had money, but I said, I want to. He said, no, why would I give up the only last piece of property here? He said, you know what, but they were very, very Jewish family. And I think that also he probably thought that if he had a synagogue with him, it would also help for the zoning. So he said, you know what, at the end of the day, it worked out. He gave me the opportunity to buy the 3 acres in the back, and he took the 3 acres in the front.
What's the location?
It's called Addison Court, and it's right on Military Trail. It's the northeast corner of Clintmore Military, right behind the Bank of America. Some people say you're like Boca's biggest secret because you don't imagine, but it's actually a beautiful, beautiful center in the back, 22,000 square feet. We have a preschool, a synagogue, a social hall, a women's ritual bath, a mikveh. So it's really a beautiful place, And I remember I was at a bris, at a circumcision, and I approached someone that I knew. I said, I have this piece of property that we're very interested in. I would like to would you join our building committee? He said, how many people do you have already? I said, no one yet. I said, you'll be my first. And at the end, not only did he join, but he also ended up purchasing the property in memory of his grandparents. So that was the beginning.
You have so many people who are so deeply dedicated to Chabad and to the education of the children, to the comfort of the families, to the intellectual growth of the membership. How did you make that happen?
It's all my wife. By the way, you make it sound so rosy. We're still in the process. They say if good is better, not better. So we're still in a process. I think that there's a couple of things that I think. First of all, we are unique, I feel, and we're unique where, you talk about Orthodox families, the Orthodox movement. If somebody would come to my synagogue, one would coin it an Orthodox synagogue, which in general the Rebbe was not for labels at all. He thought that was going to be divisive in our community. But yes, I'd like to say we're a traditional synagogue. We abide by what most people would say most Orthodox synagogues look like. But if you take a look at the membership of the synagogue, 90% of the membership are not necessarily Sabbath observant, if you want to use that as an example of their level of observance. So some may keep kosher, some may not put on tefillin, what we wear every morning for men over 13, except for Shabbat and holidays. Some men obviously are getting to synagogue, they're not walking. So the membership is not necessarily reflective of what you would imagine the affiliation, of lack of a better word, would be affiliated with, in this case, Orthodoxy. So why is that happening? It's because I think a couple of things. One, they feel the warmth. They feel that they're genuinely wanted and that they could learn at a pace that makes them comfortable. And that there's always an emphasis that you have the ability to grow every day that you're here in this world. And that's what we try to emphasize. The other interesting thing is, the synagogue has also changed in the sense that you talk about observant people. We have observant people that are moving into Boca Raton like crazy. It started with Boca Raton Synagogue. And with Boca Raton Synagogue, before the days of Rabbi Goldberg, people were moving down here. They could get 40 new families, 50 new families over a summer. So all of a sudden, there were people from New York. They could get a bundle for their homes in New York, buy something here, have the outside. Hospitals were growing, especially people that were doctors and so on were coming here. And if they were Orthodox, if they were coming from the 5 towns and so on, the game in town was Boca Raton Synagogue. That certainly wasn't happening with me. But now, later on, that did start to happen, where people who were already observant are moving to the Polo. They need that type of housing, or they want that type of housing, or moving, or younger families. So what happens now is that you have a synagogue where there's such a meshing of so many different types of people. Young families who are observant, young families who aren't, middle-aged families, older people, and to me, the beauty of that synagogue is that there are so many different age groups and people of so many different backgrounds that actually feel comfortable with each other. And I think that is extremely unique.
Has Chabad then had to change its image or its approach in coming to Boca Raton from what one would expect Chabad to be like in Crown Heights?
Okay. So it's interesting you asked that. I wanted to address that because with all our talk at the beginning about where we came from and so on and so forth, you always have to realize that Chabad, where I grew up in Montreal, did not look like the synagogue that I have. But a Chabad synagogue, let's say, who opened up near campus in Montreal, would look more like the synagogue that I have. So generally speaking, the Chabad synagogues that open all over the world don't typically look like a Chabad synagogue that caters to Chabad families that have lived in a community for 30, 40 years, or for 10 years, or 15 years, and so on and so forth. So you'll have communities, for instance, there are people in New York that are looking to move out of New York. So Chabad families who are observant from birth, let's say like me, that just want to live in a neighborhood, will find a neighborhood like Monsey to live in and start a Chabad synagogue. Those Chabad synagogues don't look anything like the ones you'll find all over the state of Florida, for instance. We typically open up because, and that's one of the reasons when the person said, we want a synagogue here, I came here to start a synagogue that didn't have a synagogue. I came here to start a synagogue, and that's why I'm not that interested that people move from other communities, put a big article in the Jewish press, let's say, by the way, beautiful growing community like a community would do in Muncie, school and all your needs. I'm here to cater to the people that are here, to draw them.
What's very interesting to me is that it was a surprise for me to learn as I was preparing for this interview, and in looking at the beautiful videos that are available online. So if you just Google Chabad Boca, you're going to see what the community looks like, and it's a very large community. How many members do you have right now?
So,
in 2016.
Well, I'm sorry?
In 2016.
In 2016. So you also have to remember that Chabad also, instead of making it only one synagogue, we have 4 synagogues in town. So our temple has about 250 to 300 families. Definitely room for more. Now, what happens is, though, because there is somewhat of a lax approach to membership, Chabad always used to have the slogan, you don't have to pay to pray. So we can have members that are very supportive of what we do for the community and may show up Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, but are not necessarily a member. So membership is a little bit different for Chabad, where most synagogues you say, okay, you have a paying member, they're a member. But us, we have our members, which are the families that say, I want to be a member of this synagogue, but then we have what we call supporters, which may be people that come only once in a while, or maybe never, and also supporters who may belong to other synagogues that just like what we do.
And want to support you financially.
Correct.
I understand most of the money has come from outside of people who would be considered observant Chabad.
That's for sure.
How did you do that?
But
what's the appeal to the larger Jewish community? Because it's such a complex thing to think about Chabad, and many of the things that you're talking about with it seems like the warmth, the welcoming, the non-requirement for observance of various levels. It's just if you come, you're happy that they've come. So it's almost to some people who would be looking at this interview saying, well, isn't that reform?
Right.
So what do you say to that?
We are reformed in some way. Every year we produce a program guide. Now, we understand that people need members and they need people. So you have a program guide that attracts people to come to a synagogue. They may say, what else do you have? Can I come to a service? Well, certainly, we're not naive that way. But with the same commitment, Chabads do believe, and that's why I say to get stuck sort of like in a pulpit rabbi, that Chabad, that's only one function. If somebody, and most rabbis probably also, but the question is to what extent? To how much time would you spend with a family that is not a member of your synagogue, will never become a member of your synagogue possibly, and they're just from out of town, their parents are here, not well in the hospital. Would you come every single day for that week that, God forbid, is the week of the last on earth, and be with the family? How much time? Chabad rabbis feel that they are here for beyond their synagogue. Now, sometimes their synagogue members may say, you need to be more available for us. But in general, we feel that we're here to help as many people as we can, independent of their affiliation with us. So, that being said, I think that's a strong appeal to people. So, for instance, when I say, by the way, I'm going to organize a lighting of the menorah in Town Center Mall, which we've done from year one, for 25 years. And what does it do really for Chabad of Central Boca? But it's something that people will constantly come over and say, well, thank you, because the tree is there, and my kids want to see something Jewish. We're from out of town. Wow, we don't even have this in our own. Why? because it's good for the Jewish community and it's good for people. And whatever it may be, we're starting a program, for instance, right now called Wisdom Circle. It's developing a real interactive, intellectual session for people in independent and assisted livings. Why does it help Chabad Central, Chabad-wise? But it's something that is being received amazingly, and it's something that's good for the Jewish community.
Rabbi Denburg, do you think that Chabad's presence in Boca Raton today is in fact a draw for other Chabad to come to South Florida to make their homes here in Boca Raton? Has it become that?
I would like to believe that. Not only that, I would like to believe that it has probably drawn other organizations to come to Boca Raton as well.
Such as?
Others.
What do you see today as in contrast to the 25 years ago that you and Rivka had arrived? What is the Chabad community today? How would you describe it?
Well, first of all, the whole community has changed. I mean, when we came, all our kosher was being bought in Miami. We'd go once in 2 weeks. Everything was, the freezer became an important element. I mean, if you take kosher establishments as a barometer almost, and it's a good one, but obviously Jewish education is even more important, but it gives a sense people need to support restaurants and kosher stores and so on. The community has evolved. A high school, 2 high schools, there's one opening up this year. I mean, just the need for these type of institutions and kosher and so on say a lot about how the community has evolved. That being said, I think that Chabad has a whole different approach than probably everyone else. In the sense, for instance, if I came to Boca and I wanted to have the monopoly on Chabad, we would never open up other centers. But for instance, take the Chabad in East Boca. Everybody was moving away from East Boca and going west. Federation, Temple Beth El, still kept their presence there, but opened up another one. And there was a sense that the Jews, not an easy segment to get because they're really snowbirds, were being forgotten. So Rabbi Nu began in East Boca, and a big uphill battle because it was hard for him there. Now, 10 years later, while the community forgot East Boca, the community's changing like crazy. People are now moving in and so on and so forth. And there's a tremendous need for a synagogue there. We could technically put up synagogues in every corner in Boca Raton. Because every development, you could go to Polo, there should be a synagogue in Polo, a synagogue in Woodfield. You have thousands of Jews. All our synagogues are possibly claiming 20%, I don't even think it's that, of affiliation of the Jewish community in Boca Raton. There is so much work yet to be done. So while we have grown and we've made institutions available, as far as Chabad's concerned, if we had the financial backing and the humility, we would be opening up centers everywhere.
I must ask you, because Chabad is seen as something different, as something difficult for some people to accept, to understand, because there's ignorance, perhaps, to understand how this all has been. Have you and Rivka and your early followers and congregants felt much in the way of anti-Semitism in the community, because particularly it's a more visible form of Judaism to some people?
You know, I knew the question would come up, and I really need to say that the answer is surprisingly no. I know that East Boca is having its issues. I certainly believe I'll go on record. As much as they deny it, I really believe there is a trace of anti-Semitism there. Do I believe they hate Jews? I think they don't want something like this coming to their neighborhood. I think they would not be able to say that if it was a church. Do I believe that there was a trace of anti-Semitism when I grew? Without doubt. But by and large, I mean, we've had it very good in this community. You know, yes, you'll get the swastika, and half of that is ignorance, half of that is teenagers. But this movement of anti-Semitism, where we always heard that Jews were not allowed to be in Boca Resort Hotel, if that's true or not true, and so on, we've come a long way, as they say. We have it very, very good here. And yes, we do have to still fight the ignorance and the anti-Semitism that in East Boca, and we should not roll over. It's a fight that needs to be fought because we're deserving to be there.
And what you're talking about, of course, is the plans for a new synagogue.
Correct.
An expensive one. I think it's budgeted at $15 million.
It might be a little less by the time the county gets by the city, but yes, definitely so. There's no doubt about it.
And the problem is a zoning one. Is that correct?
Not a zoning. It's went through all the approvals and so on. I mean, for them to be taking the city, they're not even taking us. They're taking the city to court. They're suing the city actually. For a synagogue where they could easily have a nightclub, a restaurant, or anything else that would be far busier, far noisier. There is, in East Boca, there's still an element of the good old boys. There is, but, and it's very open. We've been told that openly by people that belong to the community. So I don't want to dismiss the anti-Semitism completely, but it's there. But we've had it relatively good. We're able to hold our heads up high and be proud in this community.
What about acceptance from other Jewish communities within Boca Raton? Do you feel that it is an easy relationship between the different flavors of Judaism, if we can call it that, in Boca Raton?
So I will tell you something that I've told a lot of people. Many rabbis will say the same. I don't think it's always been this good. But it's, I think, amazingly good now. And I think it's not because of, when we came to town, I think people didn't know each other. People were a little, scared, a little... I'm trying to be very nice, but the culprits are no longer in town. For instance, I know that in a particular synagogue, from members, we have a crossover, so people that sometimes go to other synagogues, that when we first moved here, we were the subject of either a Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur sermon, the ills of Chabad. So when you have 1,000 people, and you use that platform for that, that's very, very sad. Such a thing, unless of course something changed in the climate and something was done by someone, such a thing would never happen today.
That's very good news. I have one last question for you, Rabbi Denburg. Could you tell me, of all of the things that have been accomplished and of all the difficulties and all of the changes that you've seen in Boca Raton over the last 25 years, what are you most proud of in the Chabad community?
Wow. It's the last question that's always the most difficult. Well, I'm amazingly proud of our preschool. I think it's second to none in this community. I'm amazingly proud, and because I do want to emphasize this from your last question, of the amazing camaraderie that exists between the rabbis, the early childhood directors. I mean, that's something that really could not be mentioned enough. I think that all leaders would say in this community presently. It's really amazing, the friendships and with Jewish leadership all across the board. I think that's very important. I think that the biggest accomplishment is that I think that we feel that we've hardly really even scratched the surface. I really believe that. I'm doing this for 25 years, but we're sitting together and honestly, we feel that there's so much to accomplish. So I think it's I hate to say this, it's not what we've accomplished, but it's the hunger to accomplish more. I really believe that this community, I'm hoping Anita Kaufman was wrong with one thing. She said every community has its 10 good years. I'm sure there'll be other developments, other communities that develop. I honestly believe that this community is just at its foundations. I believe there's a lot of unbelievable things yet to come.
Are you happy you came to Boca Raton?
I'm very, very happy. I'm very happy, amazingly happy. I feel that, I feel that not only did I, today's, like I mentioned, the birth date also of the founder of the Hasidic movement. He said that everything is divine providence. And that I don't believe that I just ended up getting a job here. I believe that my soul is connected here. I believe there's divine providence here. And I do believe that I'm helping people, I do get feedback sometimes, and it's positive. I get the negative too, but every time it's all about helping people, and in any way and in any form. So I'm hoping to be able to do that for many good years to come.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Denburg. It's a pleasure to have had an opportunity to learn from you today, and we wish you every success as you go forward with joy and hope and growth of your community.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you.